For those living in South Africa, today we are celebrating Freedom Day, 27 years since we became a democratic country, and for the majority of people, their freedom. However, over decades, we have seen the fragility of democracy, people's freedom and human rights being tested to the nth degree. One only has to look at the brutality and tragic loss of life in the Holocaust, the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, and other genocides to understand the need for tonight's panel discussion, Less Than Human, how dehumanizing propaganda can set the landscape for genocide. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our moderator, Adam Mendelsohn, who is the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and associate professor of history at the University of Cape Town. He is the author of The Rag Race, How Jews Sowed Their Way to Success in America and the British Empire, which was published by New York University Press in 2014, and co-editor of Jews in the Civil War, a reader with Jonathan D. Sarna, published by New York University Press in 2010, and Transnational Traditions, New Perspectives on American Jewish History with Ava Khan, Wayne State University Press in 2014. He was curator and chief historian of the exhibition, The First Jewish Americans, at the New York Historical Society, and curator of By Dawn's Early Light at the Princeton University Museum of Art. He is co-editor of the Journal American Jewish History, and I'm happy to say our newest trustee at the Cape Town Genocide and Holocaust and Genocide Center. Before I hand over to Adam, a reminder that for the duration of the panel discussion, all cameras and audio will be switched off. Should you have any questions or comments, please write them up in the Q&A block at the bottom of your screen. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Heather, and delighted to join our audience this evening. And thanks to our audience for joining us this evening. Our program, organized by the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, is titled Less Than Human, How Dehumanizing Propaganda Can Set the Landscape for Genocide. Unfortunately, as Heather has already said, this topic is a timely and urgent one. In our present illiberal age, we see plenty of evidence of name-calling and intolerance in public life, plenty of intemperate language on social media, and plenty of mistrust and prejudice against those who are imagined to be outsiders. These trends predate the COVID epidemic, but are particularly worrying given the economic and social stresses of the present. This, of course, is many degrees different from what our panelists will describe this evening. But history provides warning of what can be unleashed when we begin to imagine others as a threat to our way of life and use the language of contagion and threat to speak of vulnerable groups within our societies. Our panelists will describe three contexts where dehumanizing propaganda had, and in the latter two cases, continue to have devastating effects, providing pretext and justification for mass violence. Linda Hackner will start by describing the dehumanization of Jews in Nazi Germany. Linda is the Director of Education for the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. In that role, she's instrumental in training volunteer guides, in conducting workshops for trainee educators, and in teaching educators how to teach the Holocaust in schools. She'll be followed by Greg Constantine, who will talk about how the Rohingya have been dehumanized in Burma. Greg is an award-winning documentary photographer who has dedicated his career to working on projects focused on human rights. He has spent the past 14 years documenting the persecution and genocide of the Rohingya community in Burma. And Gabriel Hertis will speak about how foreign migrants have been dehumanized in South Africa. Gabriel is co-founder of Africa Awake, an organization that documents and exposes xenophobia, as well as assists victims of xenophobic violence. He has worked for many years in social cohesion projects aimed at bringing South Africans and foreign migrants together. A quick word to reiterate already what Heather has said about our format. So each of our speakers will present, followed by plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So please send your questions via Zoom. I will collect them and pose them to our panelists at the end. So thank you in advance to our presenters, and over to you, Linda. Linda, you're still muted. Okay.
There you go. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for this really important discussion. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you, and then I will talk while that happens. Can you all see that? Yes, you can. Now I just want to get to my slideshow, if I can move that. Sorry, chaps, just want to move that away so I can press slideshow. Okay. I don't think I have to tell anybody who's joined this panel that genocides do not happen overnight. Genocides are, it builds on processes that shape people's minds, shape their thoughts, molds them into believing that a certain group in the society is lesser, and that the group is usually a minority and are usually unable to fight back and are usually targeted for a very specific and deliberate reason, usually because they are a minority and can't fight back, and the government of the day often needs such a scapegoat. So the question is, how does a government get the targeted group to be so repugnant to the rest of the population that the rest of the population will just accept seeing them have their rights abused, seeing them have their rights removed, or in extreme cases, seeing them have their right to live taken away? Well, in Nazi Germany, a campaign of propaganda, images, newspapers, films, posters, books, school curricula, radio programs habituated the population to how the government wanted them to perceive the Jews. And it started small and then grew and grew and grew. And I'll start off with this, which is an excerpt from the testimony of a man called Fritz Ottenheimer, who heard his father and their next door neighbor having this conversation. Next door neighbor came over and he was wearing a pin, a Nazi pin, to show that he joined the Nazi party. And Fritz's father says, well, how could you join this party? To which he replied, well, you know, it's given me a lot of new jobs and one has to support the leader. When the father said, what about the Jewish people? What about what they're doing to the Jews? He said, well, it's too bad that the good have to suffer along with the bad. To which the father asked, well, which are we? And the neighbor, Hertis, said, what a question, you're good people, you're our friends. But when the father persisted, saying, but you know most of the Jews in the village, what about them? Where are all these bad Jews? And he became angry and said, you know damn well where they are. All you have to do is pick up a newspaper and turn on your radio. Where there's smoke, there's fire. So here's a person who's already starting to become habituated. I don't know why this isn't working. Sorry, guys. Don't know. Okay. The Nazis were very, very clever because they knew that as well as habituating the population, they needed against a group, they needed to create a sense of belonging to a group. And in Hitler's Mein Kampf, he wrote, if he, the ordinary German, steps for the first time out of his small workshop or out of the big enterprise in which he feels very small, into the mass meeting and is now surrounded by thousands and thousands of people with the same conviction, he himself succumbs to the magic influence of what we call mass suggestion. So people stop thinking, they stop asking questions, they become almost morally and intellectually apathetic, or if not apathetic, they choose not to ask those questions because it suits them not to. So we start with Jews being seen as warmongers. He is to blame for the war. He is a war instigator and a war extender. And behind our foreign enemies are the Jews. And if you look at these images, you'll see that all three of these men look the same. They've all got hooded eyes. They've got thick downturned lips. They've got, of course, the large hooked nose, and they're kind of behind the scenes. The one is responsible for both Bolshevism and capitalism. And you'll notice they're always dressed well, in a suit, in a top hat, which indicates, of course, money, wealth. Then you have, and that's Jews bringing trouble from outside. They bring the war, they foment the war. What about inside Germany? You have to watch out for the Jews because they will create Rassenschande against the pure German maiden. You've got to, there's this idea that there's sexual predation around the Jew. And even in a children's book called Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and No Jew on His Oath, you will see the man in the image the same, in the suit, but the same physical features. And of course, he's trying to lure the young German maiden with money. So we've got the Jew as a problem from the outside, a Jew as a problem from the inside. And when we look at the image of the eternal Jew, the ewige Jude, we see that his face is becoming more and more unhuman. He looks almost Satan-like. The coloring is yellowy green, sickly. His eyes, you see mostly the whites of his eyes. His ears are sort of pointy. And there's this really not even human looking person. Another poster for the same film shows the man with his hand open. So he's got money in his hand, but he wants more. So he's begging. So it's never enough. Tucked under his arm is the map of Russia, showing that he's a Bolshevik. And of course, so again, communist, capitalist, and the whip. He's a slave driver. He'll make you work for his money, not your own money. And then from seeing those images of almost a not human person, the Jew becomes not human. So in this image from Die Stürmer, you see a man, and this is an early image, by the way, this is 1927, and you see a man saying, once the vermin are dead, the German can blossom once more. And in this image from the 1940s, you can see a Jew as a rat. It's no longer a metaphor, it's the Jew is a rat and they have to be gotten rid of, udreten, get rid of them. So in these images, the Jew is still a mammal. There's still something that one could imagine, that it has children, etc. But in the following images, it's becoming even less and less palatable. So the Jew is a worm. He seeks to creep up on what he wants. And here you can see the Jew as a snake. Do not grow weary. Do not loosen this grip. The poisonous serpent mustn't slip away from us. This is from March 1938. And finally, the Jew is not even a creature that you can see. It is a parasite. It creeps about. It is something that is not anything that you can even see out in the natural world of nature. And so in the one eye, of course, he has the hammer and sickle, in the other, the dollar sign. And parasites, of course, is disease. Finally, the Jew is simply disease. And obviously, all of these things don't happen in separate stages. It's going on all the time, and it leads to the following. When we talk about setting the landscape for a genocide, this is how the genocide happens. So you've got letters home from members of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, who are writing to their families back in Germany, they're in Poland. Of my life today, I can tell you that things are going more or less smoothly. If you were with me now, it would be wonderful. At 7 o'clock, we have coffee, as much bread as you want, butter, sometimes puree or artificial honey. I always have 4 slices of bread, and then we work until 12. There is always good food for lunch, so everyone has plenty to eat. Depending on my mood and appetite, I can eat up to 3 helpings. Then back to work until 6 o'clock for supper. And he goes on to describe his supper. Asks his wife, how is the garden? How are the children? I love them. For you, my wife, a long, deep kiss. These are not monsters. This is a father sending love to his wife and his children, but his work is killing other fathers with wives and children. But he can't see them as that. He doesn't see them as that. Here's another one. Dear Mutti, dear children, I'm sending you a quick letter so you don't think Papa has forgotten you. Anyway, you need not worry that we are living badly. We have to eat and drink well because of the nature of our work, as I have described to you in detail. But your Papa will be very careful to strike the right balance. It's not very pleasant stuff. It's a weakness not to be able to stand the sight of dead people. The best way of overcoming it is to do it more often, and then it becomes a habit. And then he says, it is the only thing that we can do to safeguard the security of our people and our future. This man has been so, or the people have been so dehumanized, and he has been so habituated that this is what he believes is going to save the people and their future. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, I'll take them afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Let's hand over to Greg.
Hi, let me turn on my video here. There we go. Yeah, thank you very much for including me, and it's such an honor to follow Linda and how she has explained this just so in such a really accessible way for people. And also, there were several things that Linda mentioned that are, you know, these are things that Linda talked about that happened 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and so much of that you will see is almost completely applicable to what has happened currently to within the last several decades to the Rohingya community in Myanmar or Burma. And that's where I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about a little bit of context about the history of the Rohingya community. Their historical heritage has always been in Burma, predates Burma actually being a country by centuries. They are a Muslim minority in a predominantly Buddhist society. And like I said, they have lived on this land of the historical land that they call Arakan, which is on the northwest border of Burma with Bangladesh for centuries. Prior to Burma's claiming its independence, the Rohingya were very much involved in everyday society. And even after Burma claimed independence, the Rohingya were considered citizens of the country for at least a decade or two after Burma's independence in 1948. They held university positions. They were members of parliament. They were engineers, doctors, teachers, they worked for civil society. A lot of them are farmers, obviously. But they were very, very much part and parcel of Burmese society at that time. Burma, as most of you might know, is a kaleidoscope of all different sorts of ethnic minority groups in the country. Yet there is one majority ethnic group, the Bamar, which have historically always been the ones that have held the majority of the positions in government, have had the most say in terms of policies and the direction in which the country is going. And more importantly, it is the majority that basically controls the military in Burma historically. As part of, like Linda mentioned, what's really tragic about the Rohingya story is that most people today have come to the Rohingya story just within the last 5 years. They've heard about the Rohingya, they've learned about the genocide, the violence that was perpetrated against this community right around 2017. But if you pair that with the history that Linda has just mentioned, there is this slow, incremental process that has taken place that has been targeted towards the Rohingya community that dates decades. The genocide that happened against the Rohingya is not something that happened spontaneously. And this goes very much against, I think, what a lot of people feel genocide is that it's an event of spectacular violence that took place against a community where a number of people, hundreds, thousands, ended up perishing and being killed. But for the Rohingya community, this is something that went on slowly, decade after decade after decade. And what's important to know is that it's a combination of a lot of different things. It's a combination of this particular group being identified by the powers that be as a group that did not belong to the national identity of Burma, at least defined by those people who have been in power, which is the majority of Bamar in the government and in the military. And once that was established, there were decades of processes put in place to incrementally weaken this community to the point to where this burst of violence in 2017 could actually take place, be perpetrated, and to a more tragic degree, be accepted by the wider public in Burma. And a lot of that was done through two different forms. A lot of that was done systematically through government decisions, meaning over a course of probably 40 years, laws were slowly changed in Burma that excluded the Rohingya community. Local orders were put in place that constrained the Rohingya, that othered the Rohingya. Their citizenship was stripped from them in 1982. And all of this in one way or another was then heightened by the messaging coming out from the central government and the military. All of it in so many ways with the intention of solidifying in the public's view that this is the community that never belonged to Burma, does not belong to Burma, and should never belong to Burma. And in so many ways, that ended up shaping and molding the minds of people across the country in a way that made it very acceptable for this violence to be perpetrated towards this community that was a threatening other in the country. And all of these things really crystallized within the past 10 years. Linda also mentioned the technology of spreading hate speech, of spreading propaganda, and in a broader sense, the acknowledgement and harnessing of different technologies over periods of time to serve the purpose of the central message of the perpetrators, which is the military, and that is that this is a community that doesn't belong here. So if you go back 20 or 30 or 40 years, you slowly see this use of technology and this whittling away of rights and the stigmatization of this community as being an other through different forms. It all kind of started with the passages of laws, certain speeches that different leaders in Burma would make, from the first dictator of Ne Win in 1962. You know, I mean, the years following the military coup that overthrew the government there and then sent Burma on this really, really dark trajectory that would last for decades was something that was very much perpetrated by him as the Rohingya not being citizens of Burma. That was then spread through, at the time, using the technologies that they had at hand, the local state-run media. There was a time when independent press flourished in Burma, but all of that changed in the 1960s. And that was then the messaging that came across was all directed by state-run media. That then turned into, over decades, these kind of bursts of violence that was perpetrated to the Rohingya community that were in some ways justified in the public's mind because of the othering that had been done through the central government and the military. Rohingya were violently attacked, pushed out into Bangladesh, and then repatriated back in, but the messaging changed towards, these are people from Bangladesh. Can't you see they're from Bangladesh? They're coming, we're letting them back into our country from Bangladesh. Therefore, kind of heightening this sense of foreignness of the Rohingya. Really, things came to a boiling point, I would say, around 2010. You know, there was in 2010, big democratic changes were taking place in the country. Reforms were taking place. The country was opening up. And at the same time, the Rohingya were continually being demonized by the central government and other people in the country as being a threat to the country and the identity of the country and where the country was meant to go at that particular period of time. And technology, again, was harnessed. Prior to 2011, most people in Burma did not have mobile phones. Internet was not very common or accessible to people. But all of that changed when democratic reforms started to take place in 2011. Internet started to open up. All of a sudden, people have mobile phones that are accessible to very, very poor people. It was very affordable. And with those new technologies, the military identified a new way of being able to propagating and disseminating this hate speech towards the Rohingya community and how they could influence others in the country to help perpetuate it as well. So at a point in time in 2011, just around 2011, mobile phones were available, and all of those phones were basically loaded with Facebook. Independent press started to be squashed, and Facebook became the source of news. Actually, Facebook was the internet for almost the entire population in Burma. And the military identified that and harnessed it and used that. I'm going to share my screen right now and share a little bit of a resource that I think the museum there has put in place for everyone. And this is an online exhibition that was created by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., of which I was the guest. I was the curator, working with an amazing team of people there at the museum to put this online exhibition together, which now will be take on a form of a physical exhibition in the Holocaust Museum of Washington, D.C. when the museum reopens. But I think they're really excited to be collaborating with the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center on this exhibition, on this online exhibition as well. And when you go to it, what you will see is that there's several chapters laying out this, what Linda said, this very, very incremental, systematic, attritional kind of processes and structural violence that was perpetrated a lot by the messaging put out about who the Rohingya are to the general public that then made the 2017 violence acceptable by the general public. And the two chapters in particular interest, I think, to this particular panel discussion are chapters 2 and chapters 3. Chapters 2 is called Targeted, which really spells out and talks about these incremental changes, historical changes that were targeted towards the Rohingya community in terms of its othering and its slowly whittling away of rights, exclusionary policies, and the othering of this community. And it goes also, it highlights some of these quotes and things that different leaders in Burma actually said that helped reinforce to the public that this was a community that did not belong. Really, in so many ways, it erased all of this history of belonging and contributions that the Rohingya had made to Greater Burma, and repositioned the public perception of this community as being a threatening other. But for this particular panel discussion, it's really the chapter Weakened that kind of supports a lot of what I'm talking about. And I would really recommend people to go to it, because it gives this much more kind of detailed look at a period of time in which all of these different technologies were used, from state-run media to more extreme elements of the Buddhist religious community in terms of spreading hate and othering this community, and how that filtered out to the general public, and also at the same time as to how different technologies were used, specifically mobile technology, social media, YouTube were used to demonize this community. And that's really set the stage for everything that took place in 2017. And this unprecedented scale and scope of violence that killed tens of thousands of Rohingya and pushed almost 75% of the Rohingya community who were living in Burma out of Burma into Bangladesh, 700,000 people. And when you see this particular chapter, you'll recognize all of the different overlaps between what has happened over the past 10 years in Burma to the Rohingya community with past genocides, particularly the examples that Linda was talking about. So I think I'm going to end things there and open things up for Gabriel to share his presentation, which I'm really looking forward to.
Thank you, Greg. Gabriel, go right ahead.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Dimitri. My name is Gabriel, and I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa. I came here the year 2000, 2001. Like many migrants, especially from the rest of the African continent, I was attracted by the story of South Africa. It has just come out of apartheid era and entered into non-racial democracy. And that story was really attractive. Like many other migrants from the rest of the continent, I felt that there is a lot to learn in this place. And when I came here, it was an opportunity to meet people from many African countries. The opportunity that I could not get in any other country that I had lived in or had gone to. And it was quite exciting. So we had no idea actually as foreigners what was really happening with the local communities that I'm talking about. Black people in the townships, from the settlement. We only had heard the flashes of hate and attacks on foreigners. Probably in some places, like in France, prior to 2008, one or two people from Senegal had been attacked and, of course, lost their lives, thrown out of the moving train. And there was no way of identifying or associating that attack with hatred towards foreigners. And in 2008, the attacks came as a shock. It started in Alexandra Township, came as a shock, and everyone thought this country is good for everyone. The story that South Africa wants to put out, that it's a rainbow nation, was surprising to all of us. And personally, I got involved because what was happening was contrary to what I believed should happen in a country like South Africa. And as I came here to learn about the unity and how people can live together, it was contrary to what I was believing in. And I joined in and became really active in trying to bring communities together. First of all, trying to stop the violence and bringing communities together. And it was quite nice. Unfortunately, in the years following 2008, first of all, I need to say that in 2008, a third of the people who lost their lives in the attacks were South Africans. Their characteristic was that they were dark in complexion because most of black people in South Africa are not as dark as people from the rest of the continent. So it's easy to identify people who are dark of color as foreigners. And as a result, about a third of the people died. It was 66 people who died, 21 of them were South Africa. And it was quite unfortunate that even citizens could be attacked as they were taken for foreigners. Then we started now learning about what was really happening in the Black community in townships, former settlements, and former homelands. We learned that as people came to major cities like Johannesburg to look for jobs, they will be staying in separate quarters. The Shangans will stay in their own corner, the Zulus will stay in their own corner, the Tswana will stay in their own corner, the Xhosas will stay in their own corner. And it would also take a long time for them to really come together. Some of the tensions in the townships around the tribes are still happening until today. Then the foreigner came in and was added another layer of confusion to what was happening already. Now, as the years passed, the attacks mostly concentrated on those foreigners who are conducting businesses in townships. And those ones are mostly from Somalia and from Ethiopia and from Bangladesh and from Pakistan. The skin color is different from Black South Africa. So those ones are easy to identify and to target. But at the same time, in townships, a lot of people from countries, SADC countries like Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, they stay here. And they stay in those townships. And whenever they are identified, there are tensions as well about them. Now, in terms of dehumanizing them, the languages that have been used, like I said, it has already been happening between the tribes among Blacks in South Africa, where you find that commonly the Zulus are known to be stupid. They are called derogatory names, and a lot of jokes are made about Zulus. And, they are said to be rough and not kind. And you find that the Xhosas are known to be crooks, and the Shangans are known to be involved into witchcraft and all sorts of things that are happening. And we realized that the foreigners, actually, most South Africans believe that people from the rest of the continent are cannibals, and they believe that you associate with them and you are at risk. And they cannot really say exactly what kind of risk, but you hear them when they talk a little bit about some of the can poison, they can kill you, you can disappear, and all that actually, when you look at it, it's dehumanizing towards the foreign. So it has been happening, it's still happening today. And with years after the 2008, the attacks now became common in the media, although responsible media houses have tried to combat the negative reporting on migrants, the refugees, but there is a prevalence in dehumanizing language against foreigners, which makes it easy in the institutions of, especially of government, public institutions, in hospitals, in schools. It's very easy to deny services to a foreigner because of just by hearing you talking, your accent is not necessarily South African, and then when you hear they provide your document, which is another difficult thing that happens with migrants. They are getting documents that are not similar to the documents of South Africans. So it's easy to identify when you are driving on the roads and you are asked driver's license and you produce your passport document that is not a South African identity document. Then you are anything can happen to you. You can be asked for bribes. They can tell you that you are in contravention of the law. They don't even need to explain what laws they are talking about. And yeah, as a result, then attacks on foreigners are happening anytime. Now, with time came the politicians wanting to gain popularity from the local people, and they are stoking, the hatred. They are using language that is inciting against migrants, and all sorts of things that said that the migrants are taking local wives, they're taking jobs, they are dirty, they do not pay taxes. You cannot know the way they live and how they live. Those that are in business, they are said to be selling expired and fake goods. Everything that is wrong, is blamed on foreigners. I'm not saying that foreigners are right in everything, but also some rotten potatoes. But we in a law-abiding country, it is really wrong to paint everyone with the same brush and to blame all foreigners and to call for strong action against all foreigners whenever there is anything. We believe that the main issue that concerns South Africa is service delivery, and service delivery is a serious challenge. And instead of addressing the challenge head on, then the politicians tend to use foreigners as scapegoats. So I agree with you that language that humanizes tends to make people believe that yes, by attacking and condemning the other, the outsider, meaning in this case the foreigner, then everything is going to be easy. But that's not the case. So I tend also to agree with the first speaker that this language unfortunately has been habituated. People are used to it. It's now prevalent. Despite the little efforts that is done in communities to address this issue, to educate the people, something needs to be done so that this can stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Now we have a range of questions for our for our panelists. Thanks to Gabriel and to Linda, to Greg for your fascinating comments. A first question from Mika Hackner is, what are some of the processes by which this propaganda works? I mean, is it a case of repetition, so hearing endlessly the same messages relayed again and again, and having that repetition happen over a significant amount of time, or are there other factors at work here? Why do these messages gain traction? And so Linda, perhaps if you'll start talking about particularly the German case, Nazi case, why, how did it work over time? What are the key factors in terms of persuasion?
I think before I answer Mika's question, if you don't mind, I'd just like to say to Hilda Sandak-Lewin, who is very concerned that I would be showing such pictures to the learners who come to our center. Hilda, we certainly don't do that. So please don't be concerned. We are very, very careful about how we approach this with our learners. So not to worry about that. Mika, I think the Nazi situation is, and Greg, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the history of anti-Semitism played a part in the Nazis' ability to get people to so quickly, I think, accept their propaganda. And they used all sorts of methods. So they used not only religious anti-Semitism, they built on the conspiracy theory of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that has been around since 1904-5. And then, of course, they built on social issues. So in the case of the Nazi genocide, they had quite a long history to tap into and reinvent for their own purposes. I hope that answers your question. And sorry, the other thing is, don't forget that a lot of the people who got involved, particularly the intellect, particularly professors, etc., they were getting involved because they were gaining something from it. So, when that professor was kicked out because he was Jewish, it allowed younger people to take on roles of professorships, etc. Also, they were given money for different kinds of research. So there were also, it wasn't simple. It's never simple. It's never simple. I think, Greg, you'll agree with me on that.
Let me then just, I suppose, pick up on what Linda has said here, particularly about old ideas and the mobilization of older ideas. Now, Greg and Gabriel, I mean, do you see this in certainly in the Burmese case and in the South African case, where what is picked up, what stereotypes are built upon in order to dehumanize the Rohingya or Gabriel and the foreigners in the case of South Africa?
I think that in the context of the Rohingya, I think it's, I'm expanding upon what Linda just mentioned, is I think that there was this, you could see that there was this progression over a period of time in terms of exactly how the Rohingya were being identified by the powers that be. At first, it started off with the government clearly defining who a citizen was and who wasn't. And it was the exclusion of the Rohingya community as is in fitting into this national identity that is very much in Burma influenced by Buddhism and ethnicity of Bamar. And a lot of ethnic groups around Burma are all targeted as being groups that don't belong, but the Rohingya is one that's exponentially just totally different in that sense. So citizenship was targeted by the military and the government first. And then what ended up happening is you end up seeing over a period of time, it was fusing in the religious side of things into it as been not fitting into Buddhism. And then it turned into how they are a threat to that purity of Buddhism within the Burmese country, which is all wrapped in part and parcel of being a citizen of Burma. And then that ended up opening up the gates for just the blatant dehumanization of them in terms of the threatening other, calling them terrorists, not even seeing them as human, you know, associating them with animals and, you know, non-human objects and all of that, then, you know, it's all this kind of trajectory coming from a number of different kind of forces, from the central government that then filtered into the media, that then filtered into the Buddhist religious communities, which are very influential in small villages all across Burma. And it was not just that, but it was also, keep in mind, it was that no one was ever, from authority, was ever challenging this demonization or trying to recalibrate or recorrect this identification of the Rohingya as being an other and a threat. That was never done in Burma. And so when you see no one countering or challenging that from a level of authority, from Aung San Suu Kyi to various ministers, to religious leaders, to scholars, to, I mean, you take that whole portfolio of people that are influential in a country and a society, never correcting something that is obviously wrong and targeted, then it leads to this acceptance from just the wider public, from the most enlightened people in a society to the most uneducated people in society. And I think that's what you saw in Burma.
And Gabriel, in terms of then what Anna Greg has described with this sort of progression or incremental sort of march towards mass violence and genocide in South Africa, from your description, and perhaps you can add more to it. You know, has there been a progression that you've seen since 1994 in terms of a worsening of depiction of foreigners and migrants?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, there has been progression, and it is coming actually from a position whereby people in South Africa believe that the struggle from apartheid to democracy was very tense, was very difficult. It needed, you know, consistent activism in order to overcome. And when Black people were told that, you know, their lives did not improve because of the oppression, because of the apartheid system, and they believe that once they overcome it, then everything else will be sorted out, will be fine. Now, then comes 1994, and instead of now getting what they have promised, then comes other people similar to the Black people who are coming. They are not asking for housing. They are not asking for services. They do not actually expect anything from the state, from government. All they want to do is work and improve their own lives. Now, while the people are still waiting for services to be given to them, these people, new people who came, they are actually getting the jobs. They are moving into opportunities that they think are supposed to be coming to them. And of course, the tensions arise because you see, after a few years, a person who came with nothing, all of a sudden has got things, they have improved in their life. And then the local people, the citizens, are still in the same position. That's how now the language of hate was changing. And as the government was not able to give the services, so is the rhetoric against the migrants. And it has come to a point where unless something is done, and we know that government, with the assistance of the national community, has tried to come up with a nation. They came up with a document they called the National Action Plan Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. unfortunately, which is an initiative by the Department of Justice, unfortunately, it became a law. Unfortunately, the law is not funded, so implementation of it is a problem. And you see that attacks are happening, people get arrested, but they are not charged because this crime, xenophobia, is really not defined, in the laws that the country is using. You cannot charge someone with xenophobia and get away with it. So, and that's how, because they see that with impunity, they get involved in it. And anytime anyone can call for attacks, and they know that there will be no problem to them after that. And that's how people get rid of the belief that, you need to get rid of these foreigners, and after that, what we were promised prior to 1994, we are going to get.
Thanks to each of you. So Greg, you've touched on this in your response, but perhaps Linda and Gabriel, you can speak more about this, which is a question about pushback and resistance within the broader population against dehumanization. So in the case of Nazi Germany and I suppose in South Africa as well. So how loud has that pushback been? Who pushes back in both of these contexts, and why does it fail, at least in Nazi Germany? And Greg, you're welcome, of course, to chime in as well.
Well, I think what needs to be understood is that pushback in Nazi Germany was a very dangerous thing to do. The Nazis had this, if you did something, they had, I always forget the word for it, not communal punishment. What did they call it? When they would not punish you, but would bring your family and your friends and punish them before punishing you. So it was a terrible thing, and it was very dangerous to push back because you were not only putting yourself at risk, but you were putting other people at risk. Yet people still did. There were people who did. But it was dangerous, and it was frightening, and it was at risk of your own life. And when you hear stories of resistors, of people who stood up, it's unfortunately there are few of them. There are more stories of atrocities than there are of people finding their human beauty and moving that towards another person. I don't know, Greg, if you've got stories of people helping the Rohingya and really putting their own lives at risk in order to save another human.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, to be honest with you, and I guess unfortunately, I think that there were very few people inside of Burma that actually had the courage to be able to speak up and defend the humanity and dignity of and the inclusion of the Rohingya community as being part of Burma. I think that's one of the reasons, one of the contributing factors as to why everything just happened was so awful, and the scale and scope of it in 2017. I mean, I also think that the climate and the environment within Burma historically, and even up to 2017, has always left very little room for an opportunity and space for those kind of challenging voices. But I also feel like so many decades of groundwork had been laid, the foundations had been spent for so many decades for other people to almost completely not have any realistic frame of reference and context about who this community was, to be able then to have the ammunition to then be able to challenge. That's one of the other contributing factors, is that, most people in Burma, decades had been spent just to a great length of just almost erasing this community's historical claim and contributions to Burma. And when I think when a lot of people have when there is almost no frame of reference or context for someone to be able to draw on with that, then it just opened up a huge space for people to just basically accept really what everybody was telling them, and especially when that being told was coming from all these different directions within all different layers of society, and repeated over and over again. And again, technology was a huge contributing factor to that. When you have a Facebook message coming out from the Ministry of Defense claiming the Rohingya are others and a threat, and then almost simultaneously a message coming from Aung San Suu Kyi's office on Facebook in a degree supporting that, and then another thing coming from various other people within the religious community, it almost leaves no space for there to be for some element of truth to be there for people to cling on to and investigate and hold, and then have the context to challenge back. I believe that's the environment that was created in Burma.
Yeah, I think in Nazi Germany, you see, there were people who of course knew people, lived next door to Jewish people. The Jewish doctor was his, or the Jewish, shopkeeper was his. So they had relationships. Yeah, so there was perhaps more space for that than there has been with the Rohingya. Yeah.
And don't get me wrong as well, is that the fact is that the Rohingya community and the ethnic Rakhine community, which is a Buddhist community, which also they coexisted and lived together in this area of Burma for centuries. And for a large degree, they lived quite harmoniously. There was a coexistence between the two, whereas Rohingya had their neighbors and friends who were Rakhine, and Rakhine vice versa. But for some reason, for any number of different reasons, the climate existed to where those kind of binds were slowly whittled away, chipped away at, and enough doubt placed into the minds of people questioning that left very little room for solidarity across communities in that sense.
Yeah.
And you found that happening, going back even well before 2017.
And I think even if we had to look at the genocide in Rwanda, we'd find the same thing, where you have Hutu and Tutsi and intermarriage, and yet over the years of the dehumanizing talk, the chipping away at the ability to see somebody as a human being, that it would lead to that. So, and this is what we have to really be so careful of here in South Africa. We're teetering with the xenophobic attitudes. We're teetering on the edge of something, and the difference is that it doesn't have I assume it doesn't have government support, which means we've still got I think, Gabriel, we've still got a window where we can hopefully sort of pull back from the brink and not let these things expand and get greater and happen more often.
You are right, but we must also be aware that in the past, probably because of what local politicians saw happening around the world, migration changed in politics in many countries.
Oh, yeah.
They started having this populist messages, and it became really toxic. But I would say that in South Africa, rather, because a lot of people were involved in dismantling apartheid, both blacks, whites, Indians, and so forth, all over the world, including the 30 countries that are now sending people to South Africa. I tend to see that rather people are now passive. They are no longer, when they were involved, great sacrifice, get involved in fighting apartheid. And when democracy came, people started going back to their lives to build themselves. And these things happened without them really paying too much attention. That's why 2008 was a surprise to everyone.
Shock. Such a
One
shock.
was
Yeah.
in a country like South Africa, something like that can happen. But we also see it now today in the normal politics of the country with corruption. So, people never thought corruption would get to where it ended. And then now people have to use a lot of resources, have a great courage to fight, corruption. So it is the same reason with xenophobia. Those few journalists, few media houses that spoke against this new wave, populist wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. They were seen, as they are seen as brave, but a lot of South Africans who know actually who need actually to realize that this is not going to end with migrants. It's going to come even into the relations between South Africans, between blacks and whites. It will be an issue of community. They are going to turn on one another. I was telling you already that there are tensions already in the black people among the tribes, but there are also tensions between the tribes, the blacks and the Indians and the whites and the blacks, and we saw it in 2015 when the former simple xenophobia were migrants against the local. It is much deeper because the sentiment, the racism is still there. South Africans need to rise up and really fight this. If they don't, these people that are talking hatred and immigrant sentiment, they are going to continue to take advantage.
Just to build on that, Gabriel, very quickly, that you're obviously involved in pushing back against xenophobia in South Africa. And what is your experience then of receptivity to, within the society to your efforts, both in terms of willingness to ally with you, to partner with you, and perhaps the opposite as well? That's what's your sense in terms of I suppose broader willingness to take on this issue?
Thank you very much. In our interventions, we intervene at national level, at provincial level, and at local level. At national level and provincial levels, the government is the main partner stakeholder that we deal with. People understand that, first of all, this is damaging to the image of South Africa. And as such, it should not be given a chance to even continue to simmer in the community. But it's at local level where there are big problems. One research by the WITS Act, it's called African Center for Migration, in 2009 found that actually xenophobia in local communities is a result of competition of authority by local actors. People that want to become something in elections, and like we have elections later this year, they are the ones who stop this hatred. And of course, migrants live in communities, and that's why the tensions are there. And there we have adverse, results because in one community people may understand, and in another community people do not understand. In one community, a leader that has been voted in, supported by maybe a ruling party, may be okay, maybe wrong, but may be challenged by someone either from the same party or from an opposition party who's strong, who's got strong following, And the fault lines are there in communities. People are hungry, people are poor, they want services. You know, the government has not been able to offer the services. And it's very easy to start the attacks against foreigners. So what we are doing, actually, we are always fighting against time because it can crop up anywhere in any community. And we are not that many that are engaged in this fight.
So we've been asked, one of the, we have a question from the audience about social media, particularly, and it's the success of social media, or the efficacy, let's say, of social media as a mechanism for distributing, you know, or as a for inculcating hate. The question really is about counter-programming and the possibilities of counter-programming. So this, I suppose, is a question asking you to put on your advocacy hats, and Gabriel, this speaks to one of the roles that you and your organization play. So in the context of Burma as well, and have there been efforts at using social media in terms of counter-programming, in terms of combating or counter-messaging, and has it been successful in any way, or is it, again, has the scale of in a way it's too late to have any positive effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there were in the year maybe just before 2017, but particularly in the 2 or 3 years after 2017. I mean, to a degree, it was a little bit too late for anybody to really be doing anything when it comes to countering the tactics that have been taken on social media. But in the years following 2017, there was actually a lot of work that was being done to try to uncover, investigate, look at just how complex this strategy was that was used on social media as part of this genocidal process towards the Rohingya community. I think a lot of people were called out. I mean, obviously there were corporations took some kind of measures in terms of that. Facebook took down, a number of different people's Facebook pages. I mean, prior to that, in the lead up to 2017, there were some of the more vocal and prominent voices of anti-Rohingya and hate speech, anti-Muslim hate speech in Burma were kind of squashed and controlled to a degree, recalibrated. But it's almost as if like the damage had been done. I mean, we all know that the way that there is so little authority in this world of social media and in the digital world, that once it's out there, it's almost impossible to then control the fury of how it can then accelerate to such an uncontrollable kind of degree. And that's exactly what really happened with the Rohingya. I mean, the damage was done in 2017, and even post 2017 or during the violence in 2017 and in the months following the 2017, as part of the genocidal process, social media was used to cover up and reinforce and challenge and deny any of the violence that was put in place. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, technologies have always been used and harnessed by the powers that be to reach the most effective way of reaching the largest potential possible part of the population. And that was done to such a degree. I mean, 700,000 Rohingya were pushed out of the country. It's almost, 4 years now going, and they're still out of the country and living in awful conditions. There's, estimated 300,000 Rohingya still living in Rakhine State. That's all that are left, and they're living in incredibly vulnerable situation right now. So, you may not be seeing the fury of hate speech towards the Rohingya like now, like you did 4 years ago, but really that seed had been planted in people's minds. It was, and to a degree, was too late. What I think you would hope to see now is how people see the power of social media and actually changing the narrative and recorrecting the narrative of the thing that had been done. You know, how is social media being used now to kind of reconstruct the history of the Rohingya community that once existed, that was erased by the authorities? I mean, one of the things that is happening right now in Burma, because Burma is very much in the news about all the protests, about the coup that happened. We're now almost 3 months into an awful situation that has just spread all across the country and is affecting ethnic minority groups all across Burma, not just the Rohingya. But what you end up seeing right now, what is, I think, is really interesting, is that the amount of solidarity the Rohingya community, who has been pushed out of the country and where this genocide took place, the amount of solidarity that the Rohingya community is showing towards all of these other people in Burma who were complacent with the violence that took place against them is astonishing. And you would really hope that right now there is, or in the time to come, a space would open up for this recognition of a shared solidarity from other communities towards the Rohingya that can help create change in the long term. I mean, and social media is something that I really do believe can be a game changer with that. Whether that will be harnessed and how that will be harnessed moving forward is anybody's guess. But yeah, I mean, social media is still a really important thing because in so many ways, it still is the main source for how people in that country are informed and learn and provide a greater context for what decisions and what questions they can ask moving forward.
Thanks to our three panelists. I mean, on Freedom Day, there's a very sobering message from all three of you. Really a message of urgency and danger, lessons from the history in the case of Linda, from the immediate past in the case of Greg, and really the present in the case of Gabriel. So thank you very much to our three panelists for fascinating presentations and very interesting, and as I said, sobering discussion, and likewise to our audience as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.